Psychopathic CEOs are buying psychopathic politicians. Check it out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. He's the author of numerous books. Bush on the couch, Obama on the couch, Trump on the couch. His Twitter handle, and he's active on Twitter, you say hi to him, is Justin Frank, spelled just like it sounds, MD. Justin Frank MD is his Twitter handle. And Dr. Frank, welcome back to the program. Is there any place in particular you'd like to start, or I'd like to suggest that maybe we start with Bush and Obama and looking at their psychological profiles and learning what we can about them over the first half hour, and then spend the last half hour perhaps on Trump and talking about sociopathy and how it affects our society. But if you had another way that you'd like to get into all this, I'm open to it. What's on your mind today?
Well, I don't know about a half hour on Bush and Obama. We could do a little bit of that. I'd actually like to get on to some more things about Trump in terms of characteristics that he has in his character and some of the things that we've talked about before, but there's plenty going on now. And then the other question is, what? Start there?
Sure. Well, and then the other question is, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
I get these noises on this phone. Can you hear noises when I get pinged? No.
No,
okay.
No, it sounds fine.
Okay,
yeah, there might be a slight delay
and
between
everything
us,
looks
but that's
okay.
just technology.
So here's what I think is that what I think is that basically what we've seen is the way Trump has dealt with this election loss. And I wanted to start with that because I think that's very important on several different levels, if that's okay with you.
Please.
Because first of all, he talks about courage, and he wants some of the justices or a congressman or somebody to show courage and stand up and accept the fact that his election was stolen and that he really won. I think that he wants other people to have courage because he does not have courage. So he's wishing for somebody else to have courage. But the courage that he's lacking is really important because it's the courage to face loss. It's the courage to accept that he lost. It's not just about shame and humiliation. It's the courage to actually accept that he lost. And that's something that has from early childhood. His father said, you can never admit that you've lost anything. You always have to win. So when he talks about courage, he's actually talking about himself. The second thing is that when he talks about make America great again, and he talks about the way he talks in his rallies, he's essentially mobilizing people's anger, but having them deny loss, that they deny their loss, because he's saying you don't have to deal with loss. You can just deal with the reality that I'm going to make America great. So he actually gives people encouragement to not have to face reality, the reality being loss. So I think one of the biggest themes is loss. And it's very interesting because that's the one thing that we know about President-elect Biden. He's had a lot of loss that he's faced, and that he has the strength to face loss. And he's a person who actually has courage, and I think Trump envies that. He is not conscious of it, but he cannot take the fact that somebody can actually acknowledge that he's had pain in his life. And that if you can't acknowledge loss, then what's going to happen when 300,000 people die of COVID? He can't feel empathy. He can't be humane, if you will. He's not able to do that. So he becomes more and more incapacitated or crippled in a way because there's a whole part of his life that he can't ever acknowledge. And the third part related, besides the courage and the loss, is that he's always had a fantasy of being rescued. Even though he says he's self-sufficient and self-efficient, he was always rescued by his father, by Roy Cohn, by Mark Burnett from The Apprentice. And I think he has this fantasy of being rescued now by the Supreme Court, that he's going to be rescued by somebody who has more power than he does and who's going to save him. So on the one hand, he seems very strong, but on another level, he has this deep need to be rescued, which he must deny. Other people need courage in order to stand up, but he has to deny to himself his deep need to be rescued, and it's very powerful. And I think that's what's... Go ahead.
No, finish your thought. I'm sorry.
No, just one last thought is that he, in his rallies, he has been able to speak to the people who have had terrible losses in their lives, who have felt marginalized, who felt that, and they feel in a way that he says, one of them even said after one of the rallies a long time ago, that he says what I think, but what I'm afraid to say. And so people feel very connected. So, but he is essentially giving people the permission to triumph over loss. Lock her up as a triumph over loss. Get rid of this person, any protester or anybody who kneels in front of the flag is a triumph over having to think about loss or having to think about the meaning of behavior. It's a triumphant thing. But what's happened since he's lost the election is now he needs the rallies to reaffirm him. So what was once him reaffirming them, now they have to reaffirm him. That's a lot.
To what extent is that need for being saved deep in the psyche of all of us? I mean, it seems like that's at the core of Christianity, the idea of salvation. You know, that God will save us, that God sent His Son to save us, etc. Is that a universal thing? And if so, how did it get so badly twisted with Trump?
Well, first of all, that's a great question because I think that's at the core of a lot of this. The need to be saved is partly based on an experience of having been saved for most of us, and that is that when we cry and don't have words, our mother or a caretaker magically knows that we're wet or that we're hungry or that we're sleepy or that we need a cuddle. So they can actually understand us without words. So we have a fantasy that we can be really understood straight away from early on. And that then we have, by the time we develop words, we live in a world where there is magic. So the biggest magic are certain kinds of myths, and the biggest myth, obviously, is Santa Claus, that we all, and as Christmas is coming up, we all believe in Santa Claus when we're little. I don't know what people believe in the Arab world in terms of some similar thing, but I'm sure they do. They have stories and myths. And those are about magic of being rescued, of being known, of being able to be understood, and that people know what to give you and give gifts. And what happens is that when the parents, I mean, this is just with really in normal, regular life when you have a parent or two parents, what happens is that by the time you're 4 or 5, you realize that your parents are human. They make mistakes, they screw up, they lose their temper, they sometimes forget to do things, or they are so busy they're not around, they're working and trying to make a living. Whatever it is, they become disappointed. So you have to shift that feeling of loss into something that's ready-made, and that's what you were saying about Christianity. It's ready-made. It's right there. God is waiting for the 5-year-old. And I think that that's one of the origins of religion.
On society, when we have a leader who is so badly psychologically wounded, or as badly psychologically wounded as Donald Trump?
Well, the biggest problem is that we all, us Americans, let's say, in society, at one level or another, we mirror our president a little bit, no matter if it's somebody we like or don't like. So people, I still remember watching George Bush, and then a little bit later watching on interviews with Condoleezza Rice on TV, and her speech pattern, her cadence of talk had suddenly shifted from the way it used to be into sounding just like George Bush. Very similar pauses and similar behavior. So we do imitate our presidents, all of us in one way or another. People start having their hair cut like a president or acting certain ways. I think that's always been the case. But when you have a psychologically damaged president, the way Trump is seriously damaged, they evacuate the damaged parts of their personality into us and then try to make it better. So, for example, one of the things that Trump did in his first, hopefully his only inauguration speech was he talked about the crisis in the American city and how terrible things are and how violent things are. And then he talked about the crisis in industry, that all these plants are closed. So he's talking about his own damage as a child unconsciously, but that he is now going to rescue us. So we end up feeling ourselves more damaged than we might be. And then he's going to make it all better. He's like the father who comes into the room and scares the hell out of their kids with a terrible ghost story, and then leaves, and then they scream and have nightmares, and he comes back in and he says, I'm going to save you. I'll turn on the lights, and everything's going to be okay. I mean, he's that kind of person. So he evacuates, he pushes in his own anxiety into us, and people become anxious. I've never seen so many examples of anxiety in my practice or from other people as right before this election. People on both sides, right wing and left, everybody was freaking out. And that a lot of that.
To what extent do you? To what extent do you think in that inaugural, and we have a little less than a minute before we're going to bounce into another break. To what extent do you think that the subtext of that when he was talking about the cities was, there are black people in these cities, white people, I'm talking to you, I'm going to save you from them?
Yes, I think that a large part of it is the whistle of racism, and that he does talk to white people and says, and there really are the them and the us, and that's what he counted on. And in his rallies, it's almost all white people, and he pays, I guess, for a few black people to come. So he was speaking about, he was inviting part of his damage. This is really a great thing you asked. Part of his damage is that he splits the world into good and evil, good and bad, and there's nothing in between. There's no complexity.
Donald Trump, in his inaugural address, was talking about, the American carnage and specifically pointing to our cities. And, I will save you from this. And I asked you if that is if the real subtext, if the real message that Trump was trying to convey in that inaugural address was, white people across America, there's a lot of black people in the cities, and I'm going to save you from them. I'm going to protect you from them. How does that dynamic play out, and how is that impacting our society, if that analysis is accurate?
Well, part of that is that he knows how to instill fear, because he's a person who has been frightened as a child and terribly frightened of his father. He had to deal with his father, who was a tyrant at home. So part of his individual psychology is to externalize fear, his own. So he has a place to put his fear, which is fear that white people have of black people. Now, what does he do to the black people? He also makes them afraid. They're afraid of him. They're afraid of the police. He gets both sides of a split to be afraid, it seems to me. And that's his way of externalizing. I mean, he's an equal opportunity projector. He gets rid of fear, either through his racism, or he gets black people and the brown people to be afraid of him and of the powers that be. And so they don't trust the government either. So he really is amazing at doing that. Unconsciously, he was, and probably consciously, he was always afraid of his father, always afraid of him. And he writes about it sort of casually in some of his books, but basically he would never buy a building without asking his father first. And then when he finally did do something like that, once or twice he makes these parenthetical comments, I was afraid to tell my father that I did this. And he could never really stand up to his father. So he has always gotten rid of fear, and he does that through bravado, through being like his father. When he talks about how dare you talk to a president like that, when he did that with a reporter a couple of weeks ago, he was directly mimicking the way his father talked to reporters when his father was a real estate agent and people were questioning him about his unethical practices. He essentially said the exact same thing with the same tone of voice and would mock people. He's very much like his father. And I think that's one of the things that has happened in his divisiveness. But the other thing is that because he can speak to people who can't say some of their own hurts and rage and fears, he gives voice to them. And he gives voice to the voiceless, like I said on one of your other, when we were talking a few weeks ago or months ago. And that's one of his great strengths. But part of what he does is he also gives people permission to use his language, to say lock her up, to be really full of hate and rage. And he allows people to do it because he does it. I've recently become very interested in myths. And not so much myths in the traditional Freudian sense, like Oedipus and those kind of things, but actually children's fairy tales. Because I think that lots of people have talked about the Emperor's New Clothes and Trump. People haven't talked that much about Humpty Dumpty, because I worry that sometimes America is like, our democracy is like Humpty Dumpty, and all the king's horses and all the king's men can't put Humpty together again. And that's one of the biggest fears that a lot of us have about the damage that Trump has already done to our confidence in democracy and our confidence in our government. That started a long time before Trump. But the other myth that kids say to protect themselves, and Trump is a self-protector, is that sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. That's the one childhood fantasy that I really disagree with, because names can be very destructive. Calling people names is hurtful, and repeating names is hurtful. And Trump understands that more than just about anybody. That's why he says the press is the enemy of the people over and over again, why he talks about fake news over and over again. So by the 4 years of his presidency, we won't believe the results of the election because we're being lied to. Right. He gets people to disbelieve things. Now, he was lied to as a child, I think, and I worked on this a lot in my book, that one of the origins of compulsive lying is that the child has felt lied to by their parents when their parents say they love him. I love you. But to some children, that is a lie, because clearly their behavior was not loving. The father was violent and enraged. The mother was pretty unstable and sort of chronically depressed. And so they become liars. They turn passive into active. They turn their victimhood into something else, and they make us feel the way he probably felt as a little boy. Lied to, we don't know what's true, we don't know what to believe.
Dr. Frank, I wanted to ask you about sociopathy and psychopathy and where Donald Trump falls on that spectrum and how that impacts society at large, and why is it that experts on sociopathy and psychopathy suggest that there are, psychopaths and sociopaths are overrepresented not only in prison populations, but also among CEOs and arguably billionaires. I've heard that argument made. Maybe we should start by defining terms and let me know if you disagree with anything I just laid out, and how this all applies to Donald Trump.
Well, psychopathy and sociopathy are virtually interchangeable terms, so for starters. So I think that that's important to just not, there is a distinction without a difference. One has to do with the effect on society in general, psychopathy, and the other is the effect on, sociopathy is on society in general, and psychopathy is about individual relationships. But basically, they're the same thing, and the dynamic has to do with a person who has somehow learned to triumph over guilt. They don't feel guilt. They have learned to somehow not feel guilt, and Donald Trump is a great example of that. So when he was a child, as we know, he was building a building block thing, and he asked his brother, who was 2 years younger, Robert, since recently deceased from COVID, by the way. He asked him to lend him the building blocks so he could use those to help him with his tower that he was building. And of course, once Trump had them, Donald had them, they became his. He owned them, and he glued them together so they were never going to be given back to his little brother. That's a form of early kind of psychopathy. It is a person without guilt. They can take whatever they want. And it's always been this way. There have always been psychopaths in the world. You can talk about them. There's so many psychoanalytic theories about them that I don't want to get into all of that. But basically, they are without guilt, and they can look you in the eye and be very seductive. And there are lots of CEOs. Some CEOs can be psychopaths because they can rise to the top without worrying or feeling inhibited or intimidated about hurting or others or causing injury on their way to the top. I was told, and when I was a first-year resident at Harvard, very early on by the head of the department, we were all told at the same time, you don't become a psychiatrist until you lend a psychopath $5. And what that meant was that you have to not just believe everything you hear and everything that a patient tells you. You have to be suspicious, but you have to be have the experience of being seduced and tricked, lending a psychopath $5. And you realize that there are people like that, and that can happen to you. And that you need to start paying attention to people and not just believe everything you hear. People are so hungry for a leader. They're so hungry. I mean, look at the hunger for Obama when he ran for president. There was such a hunger for a person of integrity and who was a man of peace and articulate. I mean, let's forget about the racial part, but he was like a rock star, and he was just fantastic. People are hungry for that. I think there's a whole different group of people who have been hungry for a leader like Trump. They're not the same people who were hungry for Obama, but the people who were hungry for Obama were disappointed. But Obama was not a psychopath. He felt guilt. He was inhibited. He had other issues to deal with, which I wrote about in my book about him. But Trump is a psychopath. He does not. The other thing about them without guilt is that people who are psychopaths don't have the capacity for concern. He was never concerned about his injury that he did to his little brother, Robert. There is never a concern about the feelings of other people. They never say they're sorry. They don't have empathy for other people's pain, which is why he has really not talked about people dying of COVID. And I think that and they can be inspiring because some of them can be very good leaders who can, I'm not good, but very inspiring political figures who can really get people excited and worked up. For instance, psychopaths hate rules even more than the rest of us do. And they really hate everything that's a rule or regulations. So many Republicans hate rules and hate regulations, but nobody hates them as much as Donald Trump. He just hates them. And so he taps into the part of us that hate them. And I think that gives us permission to say, to hell with these rules. I don't have to do this anymore. To hell with political correctness. So psychopaths are very seductive that way, and they don't have any conscience. So the only thing they're worried about is getting caught. They don't feel guilt. So their behavior is not inhibited by concern for others. He's not concerned about hurting other people. And I really did want to get to this at some point in our interview today because I think it's really important to be very clear that Donald Trump is a killer, is a murderer, and he has no guilt about it. but he doesn't do it directly because he can stimulate other people to do it instead of him. He doesn't walk around with a gun, but he has a bully pulpit, and he bullies people, and he has essentially killed off the Republican Party. In a way, they're all afraid of him. I don't know if he has the goods on them, like some kind of J. Edgar Hoover kind of thing, where he has a little dossier on every member of the party, or what, or they're just afraid of being primaried by Trump fans. But the danger of psychopathy is they can inspire a tremendous amount of loyalty because they give people permission to hate regulations. So when you were saying about COVID, for instance, and you were saying the person responsible for the huge discrepancy between the deaths in America and the deaths in the rest of the world, a lot of that is because of the orange man, as you call him, in the White House. But it is because of that man who has given permission for all of us to have a certain kind of psychopathy, which is we shouldn't have to wear masks because that's control. We're Americans. Don't tread on me. That was our whole thing when the Pilgrims came here. They didn't want to be told what to do. That's the Wild West. So he taps into the part of us that are rugged individuals that don't want to be told what to do. So wearing a mask is worse than wearing seatbelts. I mean, I grew up before there were seatbelts, so that's an acquired thing for me. Whereas, but I mean, the people who are under 40 or probably even under 50, I don't want to age you here, but people who are under 50 grew up with seatbelts. So for them, it's just normal when they take their driver's education, they just put on a seatbelt. Well, I don't know I think little kids who put on masks will be much more easily able to deal with a future pandemic, God forbid, if it happens, because they won't resist it. They won't fight against it. But Trump taps in to the psychopathic part because we all have a little psychopathy. We might want to get some money, in the old days when there were pay phones, if you got a little extra change, you might take it and not put it back. Or if you want to park a little illegally, you could park a little illegally, and people go over the speed limit. There's lots of little subtle rule-breaking things that people like to do. Cheat a little bit on their taxes, but not too much.
To the level of society, if I may, for a moment. Years ago, I met with Professor Jack Forbes, professor of Native American Studies at UC Davis. He's now passed away. But he wrote a brilliant book called Columbus and Other Cannibals. And he said that when Native Americans, when first contact happened, Native Americans were confronted with basically three choices because they were encountering European psychopaths. They could either run, which some did. They could surrender and hope to be treated with mercy, which many did, or they could fight back, in which case they became psychopaths themselves. They became their tormentors. I'm wondering, A, what you think of that, and B, how does psychopathy play out at the level of society and culture?
The biggest problems has been for the people who are against Trump to end up using similar tactics to the ones he uses. And so we become like Trump. And one of the dangers of having to deal with a helpless situation where you're being controlled and tortured or dominated by a psychopath is sometimes the only way out of that is to become like them. It's sort of like if you can't beat them, join them. And I do think, and Nietzsche wrote a lot about this, about the danger of political opposition, that you become like the person you oppose. And so people are very upset. Many people who are fine, shall we say, fine people to use Trumpster, but people, good Christians or people who are deeply concerned about other people, they find themselves hating him, or they find themselves hoping that people around him die of COVID. Those are feelings that most people who are having them for the first time have never had consciously, and it's very disturbing because they feel guilty about it, whereas Trump doesn't give a damn about it. So the psychopaths, the stories that you heard about Columbus and other cannibals, I think that's true. I believe that. And I think that it is about the only way to fight them is to fight them and set limits. And I think that's the hardest thing to do with Trump. Trump should not have had a lame duck period of being president. He's a destructive, evil killer. Between you and me, unless this is being recorded. But he is.
No, we are on the air right now.
Oh, good. Well, that's good to know. So I think that the one thing about him is that when I worked in the hospitals and when I worked on the inpatient service, the one thing that was very clear was that when you had out-of-control adolescents or when you had people who were causing some kind of riot, you had to step in and stop them. I mean, I don't think you need police brutality, and most of the people who were protesting, over George Floyd and other things were not rioting. But with Trump, he needs to be stopped, and nobody's willing to do that. People are too afraid to do it, and I think that we've always been afraid of that kind of violence that's required. For instance, what was required in the Palm Beach problem with the hanging chads in 2000 and people banging on the doors would have been for Al Gore to say, stop it. You cannot intimidate us while we're counting votes. Nobody did that.
Right.
People are afraid. So they kick the can down the road.
Justin Frank, the author of Trump on the Couch, Bush on the Couch, Obama on the Couch, some really remarkable stuff. And Dr. Frank, in the 5 or so minutes that we have left in this hour, how can America most effectively insulate itself against future psychopaths in the White House or in other, high public office?
Well, it's a complicated thing. I mean, first of all, people can insulate themselves. I don't know if you can insulate yourself, but if you can comment in public that you had been fooled, that you had been tricked. I'm not a big fan of Tom Friedman, for instance, but I really do admire him for saying that he made a mistake about Iraq and about believing Colin Powell and believing George Bush. I mean, he really was banging the drums for war in 2003 and 4. But he finally admitted that it was a big mistake. He was fooled. He was wrong. That takes courage. I think that one of the things about psychopaths is that we either have to have been fooled and can admit it, like Neville Chamberlain probably never lent a psychopath $5, whereas Churchill probably did, so he knew that Hitler was a psychopath, whereas Neville Chamberlain hoped they could negotiate with him. And so he didn't understand that. He felt that we could work it out, but you can't negotiate with a psychopath. You have to accept the fact that you can't. Mitch McConnell is a psychopath. He's a classic psychopath, but he does it much more subtly than Trump does. But you can't negotiate with him. You can't. I mean, you think you can.
He's a sophisticated psychopath.
But he